Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Conversations. My name is Einav Avni. I'm an energy healer and alignment coach. This podcast, Healing Conversations, is here to bring awareness and excitement to anything that is natural healing, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So, thank you, everyone, for watching, for joining us here today. And in the studio with me, I have Mags Thomson. Mags, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. And it's been a while since we've seen each other. So it's also just nice to reconnect.
Indeed, indeed. And yeah, for anyone not knowing, which why should they really? We first connected a few years ago when we co-authored together the book The Power of Reinvention, which has been a highlight of my career, really. I was very excited to be a part of this project. But Marcus, tell us a little bit about you. What have you been doing since we
What
last?
have I been doing? Well, I published my book yesterday, so that's been
Yay!
quite a journey. I always say I've been a storyteller my entire life. There's a piece of writing. It's behind me. Well, that's the book, but then next, it's hard to point behind you in the mirror image. But there's a little note that I wrote when I was 3, and it only says "oma," which is the Dutch word for granny. But storytelling and writing has been part of my life since as long as I can remember. And how now that we're sort of in this evolution of who we are, and in how we find our path and our passion, I think writing and storytelling is very prominent in that. And I really believe that when we want to heal ourselves, which is why we're talking today as well, storytelling is so powerful because we are constantly viewing our world through stories. We are constantly telling ourselves stories about ourselves in the world, and we're being told stories about ourselves in the world and how we fit in it, and that completely impacts how our life manifests, right? And so if we want to change what our life is or how we feel about ourselves or the world, then we have to start changing the stories.
I love how you say it actually, because a lot of the time when we say to people, what is the story, they become a little bit defensive, and it's like, that's not a story, that's the real thing. And yeah, it is, but is it objective or more subjective? And
It's never objective. Not a single story in this world is objective. Because and even like and it's our truth, and that is absolutely true, that and but it's not fact. It's our experience of something, and who we were when we had that experience and who we are now that we're looking back on that same experience are two vastly different people. And so the experience, our interpretation of that experience is going to be different, and we can reframe it, we can see it in a different context, because when you're in it, you can't see it. I always say, when you're in the jar, you can't read the label, but once you're out of the jar, now you can read the label, and now you can understand what was going on while you were in the jar very differently.
yeah, I love what you're saying, because it really is about understanding that most of the time we create the story from one mindset, and now we're just running in the background on automatic. We don't even notice it, but now we have a chance to really ask ourselves, what is it? What is it all about? What is it that it's helping me? What is it bringing to my life? And what is something that I can maybe, like you said, reframe, look at it differently. So I really like that we're talking about this.
Well, and I think, and it's a process that keeps repeating, right? Like I because it's so my book starts at the moment where I cut ties with my parents. Um, and so I've spoken about that choice a lot over the last few years, because people tend to not understand it. And so I've spoken about it in private conversations, in public conversations a lot. And then yesterday, for our for the book launch, I had a conversation with someone that was the first of a series of conversations we're doing for the launch, and and he asked me about cutting ties and what that is, and I explained it. And as I was explaining it, I was like, "Oh, this is something I've never said about this topic. This is a new insight that I am gaining right now in this moment because I'm retelling the story again, and I've gone through more healing since the last time I spoke about it, and so the story is changing. The and it's not that the facts of the story are different. It's just that how I relate to those and the emotions that come into it, or the priorities that, the emphasis of that story, it hits different because I am not the person I was, 6 months ago when I spoke about it.
Mm. The narrative, right? It's how we say things to ourselves. But let's really get as deep as you want into all of this. The book
Happy to.
came out yesterday. The Ugly Ducklings, right?
Yeah, the Ugly Duckling Diary.
Diary, yes, yes. So where would you like to start? I'm very curious about all of it. The book, of course, but really the stories and your
Yeah.
self-learning.
So like I say, it kind of starts at the point where I decide to cut ties with my family. I always say it's a bit of a hybrid of self-help and autobiography, but what it really looks at is how is emotional abuse and how do you overcome that, and what is the effect that it has on us as human, or it had on me as a human being. So and I always say, like, emotional abuse is so hard for people to understand because it happens in anecdotes, right? It's not one big traumatic event. It's the systemic repetition of messages that happens over time, and it's sometimes it's really difficult to put words to that, um but what it tells my story of how I grew up in the family that I grew up in, which was interesting. Um, but then it also goes into, so what does, like, the chapter that we read yesterday for the launch is called Overweight in Utero. And it talks about how my mother used to say that I was overweight even before I was born. And it's this message that then, and it's not, then it doesn't just become about weight. It becomes about all these other things that are related to that, right? Like, oh, you have no self-control and you have no, or you're lazy or whatever other, and it's messages that you get from in my case, from my parents, but then that are also, echoed throughout society. Because let's face it, we're not too kind to people. Anyway, but it's these stories that can take over, and the gaslighting that comes out of these stories can really take over how you view yourself and how you view the world. And because I have believed my most of my adult life that I was overweight as a child, and not until I left my family and I started the process of healing all that programming, and my ex-husband made me look at pictures of myself as a child, and I am not an overweight child, and yet my entire life I would look at those same pictures and believe that I was overweight. It's like there's a level of, when people really make the effort to impact how you view yourself in a very negative way, they can convince you that the sky is pink, even though you know it's blue. And it creates this really difficult dissonance in your brain, because you know that there's a part of you that knows that the sky is blue. And yet when you look at the blue sky, you see it's pink because someone has convinced you it's pink. And your brain can't quite cope with that.
So I want to ask, because I think it's fascinating what you're mentioning. And of course, I guess the first step out of all of this is to recognize that the environment in which you're growing up and the emotional abuse stories and all of that is actually not a normal thing, right? That it's
It's
not
not,
everyone.
but it is your normal when you're growing up in it,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And so I often say, like, the more So the older you get, the more different influences you get and the more different relationships you start seeing. And you're like, wait, that's not normal. Because sometimes I'll tell a story about my childhood that I don't think is particularly bad. And people just go, what? And I'm like, oh, that was a bad one? Because I don't always realize the extent of it because, you know, and also because sometimes I've made it funny for myself because that's easy. That makes it easier to deal.
Right, right. Yeah, but I think it is interesting also to recognize that you, excuse me, you're telling the story kind of in silo, right? This is your experience of all of it, and sometimes it's also quite interesting to see really what was also going on for your parents, and what we now perceive as really as this negative, maybe abusive, maybe all of that. I think, I mean, I don't know if you agree, but I'm not sure that all the time what we experience as trauma, abuse, and all that was on purpose. That it was, that they set out
Oh
to do that.
no, 100%. I totally get what you're trying to say because I also know, like, I don't know what was in my mother's past, but I know that there was trauma in her past because one of her brothers cut ties with the family as well. And so if that would have been a sort of happy, balanced family, that wouldn't have happened, right? But I don't know what the story is. And I truly believe that my mother 100% did the best she could. It wasn't good enough. Like it wasn't good enough. It's also not quite the right words, but if she could have done better, she would have done better.
Hmm.
And I know that her mental health must have been awful. It must have been awful to be in her head. I can't imagine that it's a nice place to be if this is how she treats people, right?
Hmm.
So, um, but I also think that sometimes, like I can have compassion for that, but I can also remove myself from the situation and protect myself from it.
Absolutely, and I
Right.
think
So
that
it's that kind of thing. And having said that, it took me ages to get to this point, right? I don't like because people sometimes say like, oh, but I'm just mad. And I'm like, yeah, be angry about it. By all means, like don't push the anger away because that's not going to serve you either. So we have to get through all of the versions of that story until we can get to one that serves us.
yeah, and I think it's so important really to have that courage to say yes, I can see what you're going through. And I'm saying no, I am no longer allowing this to be something that impacts me. And I think that's really, really where we want to get to, especially if we consider that, we chose the family that we get into and understand that this is probably the lesson that we needed to learn in order to really get into our own. And, here you are owning it and actually finding your path without these attachments to how your parents ended up doing whatever it is that they were doing.
Yeah.
So really a success story of and an inspiring one.
Well, and I think like part of how we I think part of our own story and our evolution through it is that we can have all this stuff happening to us, and we're human beings, and we're gonna fail at stuff from time to time. We're gonna, say things to other people that we wish we hadn't said because that just happens sometimes. But I think if we can own that, and if we can say, "Hey, um, that wasn't great, and I am sorry about that. You deserved better," because I think that's where we can move forward together. And so long as someone is unwilling to address their own story and their own um, mistakes, then there's no room for growth. And that's I think where because I often say like it's more the reason why I cut ties with my family is actually more that we couldn't talk about the things that had happened. So we couldn't move forward from it. We were stuck in it.
Mm.
And actually that is the bigger problem than in many ways that was the bigger problem in order for me to maintain a relationship with my parents. There was no room for growth because if we can't acknowledge what has happened, then how are we going to move forward from it, right? Like you can't just pretend it didn't exist and hope for the best. I mean, you can, but I don't recommend it.
Yeah. No, I totally understand where you're coming from, and I really do believe that it is a very courageous step to, and one that I'm sure you didn't take lightly. It's a we have this, you know, I don't know, unwritten rule that we need to be loyal to our parents regardless of how much shit we're getting from them, and but we actually who said that we need to stay in silent and suffer? And here you are making a decision for your own growth, which I really do think it's very courageous.
Yeah, and it's definitely not a decision to make lightly. Even just um, and sometimes I don't know, like sometimes we need some distance from people, and we can sort of limit the contact or the access they have to us. Or but I think part of it as well, one of the reasons why this was needed for me is that boundaries weren't really a thing in our family. And so I sometimes say, like, it's a little bit like dog training, right? This is so disrespectful, Max. But it's when you have a dog and it's allowed on the sofa today, then you bet that it's on the sofa tomorrow. Even if we say it can't be on the sofa tomorrow, right? Like sometimes you just have to make it clear, and the harder communication is, and the less open you can be with a person, the harder the boundary has to be, and the simpler the boundary has to be, right? Like if I have friends who I can invite, who can say you can always come over whenever, because when they come over on a day when I just can't, and I can say, oh, today's not the day, and they say, okay, no problem, and go, then I can leave that open invitation, right? But if someone comes over and you say, I'm too tired, I can't do it, and they insist that you host, then the rule changes. The rule becomes you can't come over without first calling and asking permission. And I think that's how um, that's part of why it had to be one big boundary, is because it there was no communication about it. There were no this is the weird thing about this emotional abuse stuff. It's like you're not allowed to be a person. You're not an individual. You're just sort of an extension of the abuser in that case, right? Like so why would you have individual needs and desires? That's not a thing. Um, so so then it just has to be this one big boundary, and that's a really tough one to set, and it's a really really hard one to maintain. Um, and it comes with a lot of um, like it means that it's not just the people that I've said can't be in my life anymore, because it means the whole community can't be in my life. It means the place that I'm from can't be in my life, because I can't go back to it. It's done, right? Like it's a really, really, really big door that you shut. And it has all sorts of consequences, and it has required a lot of therapy to deal with.
And how old were you? Or is that a fair question when you decided that this was never gonna work out?
I was 32.
Yeah.
And the first time I mentioned it to my parents that it was something I was contemplating was probably 15 months before that.
Mm. And that obviously didn't
That had no effect.
no effect. And so here you are, finally made the decision that this is not going to work out, and you need to protect yourself and decide that you walk out, never to look back again.
Mm-hmm.
What's next? Of course, like you said, yes, therapy, but where is where
Lots of that.
is
I think mostly that decision, what that does is it creates space. It creates space for you to now address what has happened, and find a different way to let that be present in your life. Because sometimes I think when we talk about healing, a part of why we sometimes resist it, I think, is because if we move on from it, then it feels like it never existed. But it's not that it never existed. It all happened. Um, but we can let it be within us in a different way.
Mm.
And so that's really what you're creating is a space where you can do that work without constantly or without still being in the in the situation that's caused all this pain that you have to now sort of work through. um and so I um yeah, I cut ties with my parents, and then also with my sisters late a little bit later on. um and uh and I became a founding member of a peer support platform for people coming out of emotional abuse, um, which I ran for 6 years until the funding dried up. But um, because I think connecting with people, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to publish the book, right? A lot of that writing is from the blog post I wrote for that support platform, but I added much more of my own story into it, because connecting to people who have a similar experience is really good. And we always said, like, it's so liberating not to have to start every story with, now this is going to sound insane, but right, because there is something really liberating in understanding that this is your story, but you're not the only one who has this experience, and you can connect. And the connection of telling the connection of telling your story to people who understand what it's like is so healing. And I think that's where story again has such a powerful it's such a powerful tool, because we can connect to other people. We can and we can that can create transformation, right? Because suddenly we're not alone in this experience, and we can talk it through, and we can start doing that reframing of, I hadn't realized, I hadn't looked at it from that side, or I hadn't realized that this bit was connected to that bit, which is, that's a lot of what we do when we go through these things.
So what are some things that people who are going through emotional abuse, what are some things that they must be experiencing to, you know, before they recognize that this is actually that there is a name for that? Like we said before they realize that maybe it's not normal. Um,
I honestly, it took me ages to call it abuse, even after I'd left my family, because abuse is such a heavy word, and we associate it a lot more with physical aggression than we do emotional aggression. But I always think that if you're in a relationship, and whatever that relationship is, right, whether it's romantic or your parents or your boss, but if you always leave an interaction with that person confused, then start looking at it.
mhm. So I think one terms that people are kind of saying a lot more nowadays is about toxic relationship, and it's something that it is quite interesting how it's like a light bulb moment, isn't it? That all of a sudden it's like, do you know what? Now I get it, and because now you can kind of put a little heading on top of that, and now you can see everything makes sense
Yeah.
through the relationship.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, once you start seeing the pattern, by the way, you can't unsee the pattern, and it shows up a lot. Because as because we don't learn how to relate to each other very well in society. And so we're just trying to make it up as we go along, and it doesn't always go well. But I think that not every toxic relationship is also abusive,
Hmm.
because we can be super unhealthy for each other. It can also just be a mismatch between things or people, right? Like some people just, their trauma and your trauma, you just trigger each other, and it won't work. You won't be able to relate very well. But that doesn't mean that either one of you at fault. It just means that the combination of the two of you might not work. Um, and uh, but again, like I think the more we can tell these stories of what it feels like to be in that place, what it feels like to have this happen to you, the more it the more other people can see what is happening to them, right? Like um I honestly, and I'm not saying that everybody has to share their story publicly, but even if you can share that story with a good friend, or with, because then maybe they can see the pattern and help see the pattern for someone they work with, or right, like, but we have to share what this is like, because one of the things, and especially in abuse situations, one of the things that is so actively pursued by abusers to make their target feel entirely alone, right? They isolate you from everyone. And that means that you then don't feel supported and resourced enough to leave. It's that's just trapping you in the relationship, right? And so the more we can make people hear that they are not alone and that there are resources. So even if you're a friend and you think like, oh, that relationship my friend has, it's so bad. It's so bad. um but they won't hear you because they can't hear you yet.
Mm.
But I always say, like, the more you can have conversations that are open and non-judgmental, and it's so that once they get to the point where they can see it, they have someone to go to. Like, keep that door open without pressuring them into seeing it, because it's really hard to see. Again, when you're in the jar, you can't read the label.
Yeah.
So, it and it's frustrating when you're in that point where you're like, oh my God, I can see what's going on here and I can't make them see it.
And that's the same for a lot of things, right? And like if someone is drinking too much or smoking too much and all
Yeah.
of that, when you see that something is, of course, is different. There is a difference between doing something to yourself versus being in that environment that you can't see. But the idea still is that yes, you are too deep inside of it to really recognize that this is unhelpful or maybe even more.
And the more we try and push someone to that realization, the harder they will resist, right?
Yeah.
So I always say, like, keep it keep it very casual and just keep the door open. Just make sure that they know they can come to you without judgment, without shame, because one of the reasons we don't want to talk about it is because we feel shameful. And it does feel like that when you're in, and it's weird because I grew up in this family. I did very little to get stuck in it, right? Like, from the human perspective, I did, but there's still shame attached to that. But and especially when it's stuff that we're doing to ourselves. We know that smoking is bad for us. We know that drinking is bad for us. We know that not paying our bills not a great strategy to financial freedom, and yet we do it, and we feel bad about it. We feel like we are bad people and we're failing at life, and we should be able to do this. And so, in telling stories like that, we have to be met with our judgment, right? Because otherwise we can't move past it. And so if you are worried about a friend or a family member and how they are living their lives, whatever the circumstances, you have to create that judgment-free zone for them to be able to accept these stories, because we want to be the hero of our own story, and sometimes we're the villain of our own story, and it's hard to admit that.
Yeah. That's a fair point. So can you give us an example of what storytelling is, or like what is it that the Ugly Ducklings Diaries, what is it? What can we expect to see that, and how can we maybe use that in our own lives?
I mean, the book is a lot of my story, and then there's a lot of sort of what I've learned through the hours and hours and hours of therapy and research, and all of the sort of healing I've done, and how that even how there's a chapter on PTSD, and it explains exactly what's happening in your brain uh, when you're experiencing these kind of symptoms, and that puts that puts into perspective how you're feeling, looking back, or how you're. So it really is an invitation for people to look at their own experiences and to make sense of them, and to untangle it, and have, and have a companion on that journey who's been through a lot of that stuff. Um, so it's really hard to describe what it is. I always say, like, it's hybrid autobiography, self-help. Um, but it but I really intended it to be a companion piece, because, like I said, that feeling of loneliness and isolation is a hard one to cut through, and to trust as well. And then how does storytelling come into that? Well, I think, well, it's me storytelling. It's me telling the stories of what happened, but from the perspective of adult me, right? Like, I'm talking about child me, and I think in the introduction I say as well, like, there might be moments where you're like, why are you going back to your parents, right? It's that sort of, you're watching a horror movie and you're screaming at the character, the murderer is behind the curtain, right? But all of this is reflective, and I think that's a powerful thing about recording your stories and writing your stories, even if you never intend to publish them, but you create a little distance between yourself and who you were when you had that experience, and it allows you to look at it from a perspective where you've gained more insight into life, where you've had different experiences. And so that's what happens a lot in the book, where I'm telling stories about, oh, this happened, and this is how I can now see that impacted my early childhood programming. Um, and now, in talking about the book, I'm taking another step back, right? Like, like I say, it's this sort of constant process that you can go through in, how am I telling this story? What do I want this story to mean? Because that's a choice as well, right? Like we just said, we want to be the hero of our own story, and sometimes we're the villain, but we might also be the wise wizard who gives us. We can have all these different roles, and we get to decide what the story means, right? I can say, hey, this. If we go back to the overweight in utero example, good example, weird example, but it's like, early on, it was programming for that really messed up my relationship to food and to my body, and it's all of those things. And now and then it became a story of me understanding, actually, there is stuff going on in this. How am I responsible for the size I was when I was born? How is that even a thing, right? So it really helped me to sort of disconnect what I believed about myself and see that, actually, that's ludicrous. Why would you have been made to feel responsible for that? And then now, and now it's a way that I can explain how that works. And so the story is still the same story, but it serves a very different purpose now than it did when I was younger. And it was meant as a scary, a tactic of my mother to mess around in my head.
So I want to ask, I know that a lot of the time with abuse situations or I think any situation where we realize that, I don't even know how to explain it, but when we understand that there was a challenge or an issue or a problem, a
Mhm.
lot of the time we tend to take it on ourselves and kind of blame ourselves and say it was my fault. Yeah, like, how much you were weighing, when you were born. But I think more when it comes to interaction with other people. So they treat me in this way because I'm not good enough, because I am not lovable, because I am this or that. And and this is a very strong and very deep belief system.
Mhm.
And now here you are from the other side of that, having done all the work, therapy, and understanding things in a different way. But how do you find life is now? Because even if you are aware of a belief system, for example, and if you're aware of, there is incorrect one or not one that is serving you, it's still quite challenging to say, here I am, the new version of myself, the one that doesn't,
Yep.
right, that
It's
doesn't operate from that.
and honestly, it never gets easy to be
Yeah.
that. And especially when we're talking about that early childhood programming, it is deep in our system. And some days are easier than others, obviously. Um but I think, there's not one magic pill for this.
Hmm.
It is showing up consistently. It is showing yourself compassion. It is giving yourself some grace, because you're not going to be perfect, and you're going to have days where you are being an absolute chaos monkey. And you create problems for yourself because you're slipping back into an old narrative. And so but one of the things that seems to work for me is to find the connection. So when I'm having a bad day, I will find the people that I feel safe with. And I'm very fortunate that I have quite a few people now that I feel completely safe with, and I can say anything and they won't judge me. And it's hard to find those people and learn to trust those people, but you can. Um, and and the more when I'm having these difficult days where that voice pipes up a lot, rather than self-isolate, I go and find the people that make me feel safe. And those people, I can say, I need, even sometimes you just need some external validation. It's fine, you're a human being. Go get some external validation
Mm.
from someone you trust who won't take advantage.
Very important to add that, of course.
Yes.
I was thinking earlier, like you say, you decided to cut ties with your family, and I was thinking back to a time when I was, had some turmoil in a friendship that I had, and I was like, all right, I'm going to block this person. And then it was really interesting because, you know, I would block this person and like, oh no, is that the right thing to do? What are they thinking? What am I thinking? Is that, this self-validation? And then saying, okay, it actually, I found that it created a lot of more turmoil and more challenges and stuff. And I wasn't able to, I wasn't in flow with all of this. It was really challenging. And then of course, for me, it was like, right, I'm gonna leave this thing unblocked, but that allowed me to really move away and kind of make that decision. I guess it's reminding me of people that say I have a packet of cigarette with one cigarette left when they try to stop smoking. Saying,
100%. And I always say, like, my decision might not be the decision that someone else makes, right? Like, it's so individual what works and what doesn't work for you.
oh no, I think I've got absolutely, and I think it sounds like moving away was definitely very important for you, for who you are and how you moved on. I'm just going back to how much turmoil this actually brings up to say, okay, this is my decision, and then actually, kind of aligning behind it to say this is really the thing that is going to make a real difference. Probably also because you probably tried so many different other things before, but
It's not in our sort of programming, right? Like, as humans, we tend to want our parents to be proud of us and like us and love us and all of those things. And so, which also makes it really difficult, because that means that we are pre we are what was I trying to say? We're pre-programmed to believe what our parents are saying about us and how they treat us, right? And so I always say, like, when you have such a difficult relationship to a parent, you don't, as a child, you don't wonder what's wrong with your parent. You wonder what's wrong with you, that your parent can't love you, because parents are supposed to love you, right?
mhm.
And that is a very deep programming. And some days, and that can come up when you're in a place where you want to do well, like in your job, you want to do well, right? Like, you're on a project, you want to do well, and then people discard your work and you're like, oh my God, I'm a big failure, right? Like I had this quite recently where some work that I'd done kind of disappeared into a desk drawer and it completely spun me out. I like, and so I had a conversation about it, and what was really helpful was that the suggestions that I was given were very much about, okay, so how can you take back some of that control? Because now it's just kind of happening to you, right? Like, so what are the things that you can do that will have a positive impact on how you feel about your work and how we feel about your work, right? Like, and it was a really nice conversation actually. But it's this, I think a lot of times when we're in this sort of healing space, it feels like all this stuff has happened to us or is happening to us, and we have zero control over it, which is also when we tend to get quite defensive about it, and that's not helpful. Um, but I think if we can then find ways where we can say, oh, but actually, I have a measure of control about this. And I think one of the ways that we can control it a little bit, at least, is to say, how can I reframe this? How can I look at this differently? What if I move, 15 degrees south? Now look at the same story. What happens? How is it different? And that is a process that we can do that doesn't require us to change our behavior yet.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's a like a lag, right? Because when you understand things differently, sometimes you might want to to act differently, and sometimes you just don't need to do anything anymore because you've kind of sorted it out in your mind, and it's now becoming a very helpful or useful lessons to move forward with.
Yeah. But I think there's always a benefit to looking at a story from a different angle. And so we started this conversation with you saying, well, there must have been stuff going on for your parents as well, for them to, behave in the way they did. And I've done writing, like I obviously write a lot because I'm a writer, but I really do think like journaling and writing and it helps you organize your thoughts in a different way. And I've written so many letters to my parents that they will never read because a lot of them are very angry. Um, but it's just a way to sort of work through the emotion, right? But I also sometimes try and write the story from the perspective of one of the other players in that story. Like, what was that experience like for them? And it's really hard. That is yeah, that it really is really tough, but it helped me a lot to see them more as people, right? Like, um I saw this interview recently with someone where someone asked an actor, like, how can you play evil people so well? And he goes like, because I just play people. Nobody believes they're evil, right? Their motivation isn't evil. Their
Mm.
motivation is still self-preservation, and all of the things that we are trying to do, they are also trying to do.
Yeah. When I was doing my NLP training, I remember one of the exercises was really to find an instance where you got triggered or some interaction that is really unhelpful or not going very well. And first of all, so of course you can imagine a room with two chairs, and first of all you are in the speaking chair and you say, "This is my story. This is my belief. This is how I see the problem." And then you say, "Okay, now you change places, and now you sit in the other person's chair, and you basically say, 'This is what I see, and this is how I believe, and what I believe in, and everything that they can say about the problem.'" And then the really nice thing to do next is to say, okay, now imagine that you're a fly on the wall and you're looking at these two people with this very awkward interaction, and what do you see about them? Something that actually you couldn't see from your point of view or their point of view, but now you can see from a completely different perspective.
Um,
And I think it's very helpful as well, because you can really see that people, like you say, we don't get up in the morning and say, right, today I'm going to do some really terrible things. Most of us don't, I guess, but
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 even
yeah.
the people that do will think that the terrible thing that they are doing it serves a benefit,
It justifies it. Yes, exactly.
right? Like there will be a justification for it. But I think, and just it's quite hard to do this for your own story, especially for stories that are quite core to who you are and your core beliefs, but or just core trauma. Anyway, but you can do it from just with stories, because it's a skill that you can practice, right? To look at stuff from other people's perspective. And so if you start with, I don't know, start with Snow White and write the story from the perspective of the evil queen, or like, but it it will sort of start training this muscle of what happens when I look at the same story and the same experiences, but I look at it from a different perspective or from a different player. And I think it's always helpful when we can do that. I think it expands our mind. I think it allows us to absorb new ideas and be open-minded about things. Because as humans, we are wired to learn through story and through storytelling. That's just how our brain works. And don't ever tell me that you're not a storyteller, because one time in your life you will have said good morning to someone and they didn't say good morning back, and it spiraled into this whole story about how they didn't like you. That's what your brain does.
I've been there.
We've all
I've
been
been
there.
there.
That's happened to everyone. And that's how our brain functions, right? And we and how we take information in is when it's facts, we can take in facts, but when facts are put into story context, then suddenly our whole brain lights up rather than just the bit that is concerned with facts. Because suddenly it's about emotion and it's about color and it's about texture and it's about all of these things, right? And our whole brain starts getting engaged. And that's how we come to new conclusions.
And I can definitely see how when you bring in all of these things that you just mentioned, how you create that space between, whatever is happening inside to look at things with more space, really. Space is an important word here. I guess the question, can you give us an example to a story that you tell, be it about something from the book or anything else that people can see or hear or feel that we are on the same page, I guess.
Oh, that's a big question. A story, you mean a story where I've gone through sort of those different where the space has been created?
For anything that feels right. Yes.
um I sometimes pull up this photo of there's a photo of me when I was like 1 year old, and I am holding a wine bottle. And this photo is the genesis of the story that my parents used to tell of how I was an alcoholic at age 1, um, which is really weird. Um, and for a long time, and that was a story that was told kind of as a joke, but when a story is repeated often enough, whether jokingly or not, it gets its hooks in you. So for a long time, that photo was sort of evidence of my infant alcoholism. I don't know if that's even a thing. And then at some point, it became like, after I cut ties um, and I was processing through all of the childhood stuff, and suddenly that story and that photo became, hang on a minute, this is ridiculous. It's a weird story, but also, so the story was that I would go into the hallway and find the recycling and then drink the last bits of wine from the wine bottles. This was how I was an alcoholic. And I was like, and then suddenly, once I took a step back and I looked at that story again, I was like, but hang on a minute, I was a 1 year old. So isn't it, if it even happened, that's questionable. But if it happened, wasn't it my parents' responsibility to make sure that a 1 year old can't get to wine bottles? Because that seems dangerous, right? So suddenly you're looking at this from, hey, okay, even if I did that, even if that's the story that happened, I don't know, I was a 1 year old, so I have no memory of it. Suddenly looking at it from my parents' perspective, hang on a minute, that's that's not the problem of the story here, right? Like, so you look at it through different glasses suddenly, and whether that's my adult glasses or their adult glasses, but suddenly you see the same story, the same thing that happened, the same photo, and it's a whole different story because now suddenly it's a story of potential neglect, right? Which is very different from a 1-year-old alcoholic. And so, so it's, I laugh about it now, but
Yeah.
it's some of these stories are just really weird. Um, but so it's the changing perspective of you as you evolve and heal and grow, and as you want different things in your life, and then the meaning of the story changes, because where previously that was proof of me being undisciplined and lazy and self-indulgent and all of the things that we kind of as a society even associate with people who drink too much, right? There's a lot of judgment there. So
Mm.
you all of those kind of feelings take hold of you as you're growing up, and you keep hearing that story about yourself. And I always say, like, to a degree where I was very careful about drinking and when I would drink and when I wouldn't drink, because I felt at risk of becoming an alcoholic. Like I felt there was an increased risk for me, right? That's how much that notion took hold of me, that it impacted how I behaved in my early 20s. Um, but now it's a story that informs, oh, actually, this is the dysfunction of our family, right?
Mm.
And it's an illustration of that. So it serves a very different purpose in sort of the book of my life, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. And so tell me, so you've had all of these experiences and the events and the making sense of them and getting through that and reading the book and done the blog and all of that. So what is next? Really, what is next for you?
I mean, this happened yesterday, so I don't have a clear plan just yet. But what I really do with people is for them to record their stories, and whether that is in the context of their business or in the context of just their personal life. I think we've sort of fallen into a trap where every story can only be 30 seconds long because otherwise it doesn't fit the algorithms or whatever. And I think that's such a waste because we're missing texture and oomph in the stories that we're telling. So I want to help people find the stories that they can tell that will help them connect to other people and potentially help them transform and motivate and do all of those things. Because again, I think this is how as humans we process information, and if we can tell more stories and have a more diverse have more diverse stories be part of what we consume in information, then that allows for us to feel more comfortable when our story isn't the main narrative, right? Like, so when we feel different or othered, if there are other people who share that story, then we feel less alone. And that is true for a story of abuse, but it is true for any story where we feel like we are other.
And I guess it's also kind of makes some sense also because now that you've been through all of that, you can inspire other people. You can help lift other people. You can maybe be the person or the reason why someone else is saying, "Do you know what? I'm not staying there anymore." So then your own story is becoming a little bit more. There's more purpose to it, right?
And I think everybody's story has that potential, and it doesn't have to end up in a book because not everybody wants to write a book. I get that. It's a lot of work. Uh, but even sharing a story with a neighbor or a friend, or like our stories can have such beautiful ripple effects.
Mhm. Nice. I like that. Tell the story. Tell the story. Find somewhere safe. Tell the story.
Find someone safe and tell a story.
Right. And so, Mags, where can people find your book? It came out today.
They can go to my website, which is House of Hives, and it's listed under my stories, the Ugly Duckling Diary. I'm also planning on publishing some interviews I've had with other people with interesting childhood stories or just stories. And so, yeah, come check back for those once they start appearing. I'm calling them the Duckling Diaries because I think so many of us have been made to feel small and insignificant, and we're not.
I think this is a very important message for really for for anyone watching or listening. It's that questioning, because a lot of the time people would say, for example, oh, I've had a really happy childhood or whatever, and then when you start talking to them, you kind of things start to come out. I'm not saying that it's impossible to have a really happy childhood, but there are things there that you glazed over. So when you're able to start saying, really, how come I'm doing this, or how come this is my approach, or how come this is going on, you can find a lot of answers. And when you feel safe enough to really go there and explore, you don't have to point fingers at anyone, but you just need to go and have another look. A lot of answers can be found there.
Yeah, for sure.
So before we say goodbye for today, tell me, what is one thing that, other than find the safe space and tell your story, what is one thing that you really want people to go away with from our conversation today?
Um, I think, or I hope that it will inspire people to test that perspective, like like start with something simple, but start learning to look at the different perspectives that a story can have. I think that it's such an important skill in life if we can reframe things. Reframing is it, it's crucial to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it really does have the potential to help you see, to put things in perspective, and then yeah, maybe have a little bit easier day.
Yeah, and it can be something small, right? Like sometimes, like was talking to someone and they were like, "Oh, I helped a person, but there's like another, 1,000 people that need our help, and I've only helped one person." I says, "Yeah, but you helped one person,
Yeah.
right?" And it's sometimes we just need someone to say that, even that's like the smallest reframe, because that one person that we can help can then go, then we create capacity within that person to help other people, right? Like an accumulative effect. And I
Yeah.
think the same is for when we start healing and evolving and transforming. Like the more we can do that for ourselves, the more we can have that ripple effect in the world.
Mm, love it. Love it. Well, Max, thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing your story and for having, the courage really to go through all of this, but to share it and to inspire all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was my pleasure.
Wonderful. And for everyone else, everyone watching or listening, please do share this podcast. There are people out there that really need to hear these messages, and this is how we get there. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks you, Mike, and see you next week.